Welcome to Enchanted Astrology with Ariel Smith. Thank you so much for joining me as we take a look at the astrological forecast for the week of May 6th until May 12th. Now, this week we have Pluto stationing retrograde. We have the Sun and Mercury traveling together through Taurus all week and later forming a sextile to Jupiter in Cancer. We have Mars continuing to square Jupiter this week, and by the end of the week, Mars starts to come into a sextile with Venus, and we have Venus opposing Black Moon Lilith. Now, to start the week off, we have Pluto stationing retrograde on May 6th at 5 degrees of Aquarius, and with Pluto stationing retrograde, what is beneath the surface can start to rise up into our awareness. So we can be more aware of things like our fears and buried emotions that are sitting just beneath our conscious awareness. And Pluto is an energy that when these subconscious realms, these fears and buried emotions, create a blockage in our energy, Pluto demands that gets rectified. So eventually something's got to give. And when you think of a blockage, it puts strain on the flow, and eventually with enough pressure building up, with enough strain, the blockage will burst or released if it's not dealt with. And that is Pluto energy. So if we notice those blockages, the building of pressure, if we notice it early and we tend to them, then we can keep the flow healthy and unrestricted. But when we ignore, suppress, or avoid tending to those energies, eventually they start to make noise and build up pressure, and then we become more aware of them until something gives, and eventually the flow will be restored one way or another. So there can be a sense of needing to make a change as we feel the energy build up, right? It can be like, I can't keep doing this anymore. Something's got to change. Something's got to give. And we become more aware of it and start to engage with it more directly because of that. Now, Pluto in Aquarius specifically has been challenging our minds and the way we think and what we think we know. It's also been challenging the way we connect our personal and our collective identity and how we structure ourselves in response to these new ideologies and new information. So Pluto in Aquarius is obviously deeply changing our world and how we understand and relate to it. And with Pluto stationing retrograde, it turns that awareness inward first so that we can become aware of just how deeply embedded we are inside the systems that are now changing. So our language tends to cast blame outside first. So it's like saying the world is a mess or these other people are doing XYZ. And we say this because we have been taught that we are passive observers of the world. We tend to default to that kind of a language where it's sort of everyone else that needs to make changes because it's, what we're observing. And especially when you feel powerless. So Pluto in Aquarius, however, is redistributing that power back onto each and every individual so that we recognize the power we do have within, We align our body, mind, and soul with our heart's desire and embrace the power we hold in our own energy system. We can function very efficiently individually within our own energy system. And when we do, we can affect greater change than we give ourselves credit for. But when we are inefficient with our energy system, because of all of these blocks, right, that arise from fear, projection, outdated beliefs, etc., then we have little energy left to command and work with. So Pluto retrograde in Aquarius will take us internally to recognize where we can each start our process of change within, where we are not aligned with our own authenticity, and where we can take our individual power back, where we can restore the efficiency of our energetic system. And everything that comes up in Pluto's realms of fear, attachments, power dynamics, obsession, trauma, and all the shadow aspects that we suppress, that will inform us of our energetic efficiency, how much command we have over our own energy, and how we can heal, transform, and renew it. Now, another aspect this week, we have the Sun and Mercury traveling together in Taurus. They start the week off at a 9-degree orb that closes to around 2 degrees by the end of the week. Taurus is slow, steady, and likes what is familiar and comfortable. And so with Mercury here, how does our mind work with that type of energy? Well, I am finishing up my undergrad degree in psychology, and in a cognition course that is focused on how neurons respond to and encode different stimuli, we learned about a famous experiment conducted in the 50s and 60s by Hubel and Wiesel, where they recorded neural activity in different cats, and individual neurons didn't respond to whole objects themselves. They responded to very simple features instead. So specifically in this case, lines at different angles. So some neurons fired for horizontal lines, and some fired for vertical lines. So your brain is building what you see based on simple principles and fragments and puts it together. So the world we see does not exist in this neutral state that we observe with our eyeballs and capture it like a camera. The eyes are not responsible for what we see. They are one of the senses that picks up information, and the world we see is constructed in our brain. So that can be vastly different from person to person. And in this experiment, they raised kittens in these controlled environments where one group only saw vertical lines and the other group only saw horizontal lines. And this is during a young age when they are still receiving information to learn how to make predictions about their world. In an early age, your brain is learning how to build a schematic of its world. So what happened was the vertical world cats could see vertical lines, but were blind to horizontal ones. And horizontal world cats were the opposite. They could not see vertical lines. In fact, they would literally bump into objects that had vertical lines because they could not see them. And even in humans, they've found that people who live in cities are faster at detecting vertical lines, right, because of tall buildings. And rural living people tend to be better at recognizing more irregular angles. So we don't passively see reality. Our eyes are not cameras. We are learning to recognize and perceive patterns. And the patterns you see are what your brain has been trained to recognize. So what is familiar to you becomes what you attune to and therefore experience. Now, this makes me think of children and how they come into the world so open, and how many worlds do they actually perceive? But through conditioning, right, our culture has tended to shut down unfamiliar or quote unquote unrealistic experiences because we cannot perceive them. So if a child has an imaginary friend or perceives something we don't, we have basically chalked it up to just a child's imagination running wild. But is it really that, or are we maybe just attuned to the horizontal world and we can't perceive the vertical one? It also makes me think of how we tend to have the same experiences that we are familiar with. And from a nervous system perspective, the polyvagal theory has demonstrated that the nervous system basically acts kind of like a thermostat, and whatever it's set to, hot or cold or anything in between, is what is familiar and therefore comfortable. So your experiences and what has been familiar and comfortable sets the temperature essentially of your nervous system and what it feels okay with. So polyvagal theory is about training your nervous system to feel safe and comfortable with different situations, maybe different financial situations or romantic situations or work situations. And Taurus would be the energy of us building a world that has become familiar. And essentially not being able to see or feel comfortable with anything other than what is familiar. So with the sun in Taurus, we build our identity from the familiar. It becomes who we are. We are the person who always has lack or can't see abundance, or the person who is always single, or the person who bad things always happen to, or maybe good things. And if we don't actively look for other experiences, for what is hidden from us, if we don't actively try to transform these experiences with the polarizing Scorpio energy, then Taurus will just stay the same. Taurus will stay the course and continue to have the same experience, which it has been building slowly over time. And having Pluto in retrograde in Aquarius, along with this Mercury Sun traveling together through Taurus, this reminds me of Descartes. Now, René Descartes was a philosopher in the 17th century who was famous for trying to essentially rebuild what we can know for certain when you remove anything that can be doubted. His famous expression is, "I think, therefore I am," because in the end, that was the only undoubtable truth that remained. And he goes through these meditations in the form of philosophical reflections where he just starts doubting everything. He questions the senses, he questions everything in the external material world. So Descartes notices that the senses can deceive us, and very often, in fact, like when distant objects look small or something appears bent when it's in water. And he says, if I know that the senses deceive me sometimes, how do I know that they aren't deceiving me all the time? He goes on to question, how can he know that he's not dreaming, since dreams can appear so vivid and detailed that they seem very real, and there's no indication of dreaming while you are in a dream. So Descartes goes through this process of processing his material world, and what can he really be sure about? And rather than operate on assumption, on autopilot, absorbing information from the world around us that we've just been taught and taken for granted, and building our identity and sense of self around that, he just questions everything to better understand himself. So this Mercury Sun in Taurus, along with Pluto being retrograde in Aquarius, feels like a Descartes journey. One where we've been building our worlds through what we have experienced, what we have been taught by our education system, our society, economy, and what we have been exposed to. And we've essentially constructed a horizontal world. And in doing so, we have been completely unable to see the vertical one, or unable to see what exists beyond the schematic we have built in our mind. And while it may keep reinforcing itself, it is not the only experience. And Pluto is asking us to question this, question our own understanding of our world, knowledge, the neural pathways we have reinforced. And he's asking us to take a second look, train new pathways, and interrupt the feedback loop where we only see what we expect to see. And as this Sun-Mercury conjunction journey continues this week, starting on May 10th, it forms a sextile to Jupiter in Cancer, where we expand our sense of safety. Our external world seems less threatening somehow. It seems more fluid and less rigid as we once thought. And as we train ourselves to question, to seek out different understandings, different experiences and information, we start to see a different world appear. Now, this week's Yin Yoga practice will be on this Mercury Sun conjunction in Taurus as we go through how your mind becomes attuned to the familiar and some Descartes style meditations, so you can get a sense for how this shows up, what it feels like moving through this, and actively work with it. Now, this ongoing square between Mars in Aries and Jupiter in Cancer is also in aspect all week, but the felt effects will decrease each day as it separates by the end of the week. So Jupiter in Cancer is amplifying our emotional experience. We can feel more sensitive and attuned to our environment and those around us. We can feel more intuitive, protective, nurturing, and supportive. And with Jupiter squaring Mars, that Cancer energy can form a tension internally with how we act. So depending on how you work with your Cancer and Aries energy will determine on what spectrum this plays out. So on the lower spectrum, Cancer energy can be a bit defensive, overprotective. It can be emotionally reactive and non-communicative because Cancer is so intuitive that it can sometimes just expect others to know its thoughts and feelings. And lower octave Aries energy can be a bit reactive, impatient, conflict-driven, and somewhat domineering. So when we have a square here on the lower octaves, it can manifest as being emotionally reactive, maybe overreactive, possibly saying something out of defensiveness that you later regret, feeling like, you need to fight, control, or impulsively act on an emotional experience. And on the higher octaves, Cancer energy is very emotionally intelligent. It is nurturing. It is deeply caring and protective without overreacting. Higher Cancer energy can create a very safe environment inside and out. And higher octave Aries energy is very decisive and courageous. It knows self-control. It is focused and clear in its actions. So this square can also manifest on the higher expression, where we feel a sense of duty to protect, nurture, and create a sense of safety, and we know how to direct our energy to accomplish this. It could be being an advocate of some kind, or bravely acting from a place of emotional intelligence and intuition. So the lower expression is emotionally triggered and reactive, and the higher expression is having a heightened sense of emotional awareness and taking action from there. So there is a friction here that plays out, but the manner in which it plays out depends on how each individual person is working with those Cancer and Aries energies. Now, by the end of the week, Mars begins to come into sextile with that Venus in Gemini. So the tension that Mars was feeling during his square to Jupiter is now starting to get resolved and gaining support in the form of ideas, communication, or shared perspectives that can ultimately support that Mars's drive. So there is a lightness here that helps that Mars to be adaptable, curious, and relational. Now, speaking of Venus, Venus starts off her week with an opposition to Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius on May 6th. Oppositions often show up in the external world in something we see as being outside of ourselves, or what we project onto others. And this projection happens as we try to find the balance between both sides, as we work to integrate both sides. So Venus in Gemini is relational. She wants to keep things light, humorous, conversational, harmonious, and she is curious. And Black Moon Lilith is a calculated lunar point that symbolizes raw, taboo, or rejected energy. And Venus is trying to work with that and relate to it here. So Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius is about the raw, unfiltered truth. She rejects anything superficial or inauthentic, and she has a hunger for meaning and freedom. And here we have this Venus that is almost the exact opposite. She wants to keep conversation harmonious, light, charming, maybe witty, and Lilith in Sagittarius rejects that. She wants what is raw, uncompromising, unfiltered, and even sometimes offensive, to be seen and expressed in the name of meaning. So with the opposition here, depending on what energy you have integrated more, we could see a projection of Lilith as someone outside of us being too intense, too opinionated or dogmatic. Or we could see a projection of Venus and Gemini, with seeing someone else as too superficial, uncommitted, or inauthentic. Now, when these energies balance in the higher expression, it can be integrating your own raw, unfiltered meaning so deeply that you don't seek to impose your truth on others because it is so deep and secure within yourself. And that changes the way that you relate to those around you. You can stay somewhat more superficial and light in conversation because you are no longer using conversation to integrate your own meaning. Where unintegrated, you may feel the need to convince others or prove them wrong because of the internal need to feel that your opinion or truth is the one and only correct truth. But once you know it is the only correct truth for you, that desire to project it dissolves, and you can accept other points of view without it challenging your own. You can listen to conversation without it pulling on a nerve, and you can share your honest opinion in a non-emotionally charged way because you're simply just expressing your truth without needing it to have any sort of effect externally. So from May 6th to 8th, watch what shows up, what might be projecting, and pay attention to how you feel about your own raw truth inside. Well, that wraps up the astrology of this week. And again, if you would like to go deeper with the Sun and Mercury in Taurus this week, please feel free to check out that yin class available on enchantedistrology.ca. And as always, thank you so much for listening in today. I will be back next week with another episode.